In the summer of 1944, as Allied armies poured across the beaches of Normandy, German field marshals and generals gathered around their maps in hushed, anxious tones. They spoke of many threats: Patton's armored spearheads, Montgomery's deliberate set pieces, the endless American material flooding the continent. Yet one name, more than any other, made experienced Wehrmacht and SS officers fall silent and exchange uneasy glances: Lieutenant General Guy Granville Simonds, commander of the 2 Canadian Corps. A 41-year-old Canadian with a thin face, cold eyes, and a reputation that spread through the German ranks like frostbite. To the soldiers of the Reich facing the British and Canadian sector, Simonds was not just a name. It was a promise of sudden, violent, and almost certain death. Why did hardened German commanders, men who had fought from Poland to France, from the gates of Moscow to the deserts of North Africa, fear this quiet Canadian more than the flamboyant Patton or the relentless Bradley? The answer lies not in propaganda or myth, but in the bloody ledger of battles fought in the mud and cornfields of Normandy, across the flooded lowlands of Holland, and finally into the heart of the Reich itself. Simonds did not shout, did not seek headlines, did not pose for photographers. He simply killed German divisions with a precision and ruthlessness that left survivors shaken and high command desperate. Guy Simonds was born in 1903 in Berry Street, Edmonds, England, but raised in British Columbia. A boy who grew up riding horses across vast Canadian prairies and absorbing the stern discipline of British military tradition. He entered the Royal Military College of Canada and graduated near the top of his class, then sailed to England to attend the Staff College at Camberwell, the same institution that produced men like Montgomery and Allenbrook. Even as a young officer, he was noticed for his intellect. Fellow students remembered how he could look at a tactical problem for 30 seconds, ask 2 quiet questions, and then deliver a solution that left instructors speechless. One British general later said, "Simonds thinks in straight lines while the rest of us are still drawing curves." When war came in 1939, Simonds rose meteorically. By 1943, at the age of 40, he was the youngest major general in the British Empire forces and given command of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division in Italy. There he learned the hardest lessons of modern war: how fragile flesh is against steel, how quickly momentum can be lost, how easily good men can die for bad plans. He watched Allied attacks smash against Monte Cassino and the Hitler line, saw divisions bled white for a few hundred yards of mountain. Something cold and calculating crystallized inside him. Never again, he decided, would his men die because of outdated doctrine or timid leadership. Back in England in early 1944, he was promoted again, now commander of the newly formed 2 Canadian Corps. The appointment raised eyebrows. Many senior British officers believed Canadians were fine soldiers but lacked the professional polish at higher levels. Simonds set out to prove them spectacularly wrong. He began a ruthless training regime that shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Live-fire exercises with real tanks and real artillery thundering overhead. Night attacks again and again until men could move through darkness as easily as daylight. New weapons. The funny-looking, specialized armor of Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division were welded into his plans from the beginning, not added as an afterthought. But it was his mind that truly terrified the Germans once they encountered it. Simonds did not believe in the traditional Commonwealth set-piece battle that began at dawn with a massive bombardment everyone could hear 10 miles away. He preferred the night, the fog, the unexpected angle. He studied German defensive doctrine obsessively and then systematically violated every one of its sacred rules. Where the Germans expected a deliberate advance behind a creeping barrage, Simonds struck like a cobra, fast, armored, and usually in darkness. The first time the Germans truly felt his hand was Operation Totalize, south of Caen, in August 1944. For weeks, the Canadian sector had been a graveyard of burned-out tanks and shattered regiments. The road to Falaise, the jaws of the trap that would destroy the German Army Group B, lay through a killing ground dominated by Tigers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the heaviest concentration of 88mm guns on the Western Front. Every previous attack had been stopped dead. Simonds gathered his corps in secrecy. He ordered his armored divisions to be converted into what he called Getty's columns, named after an engineering officer who helped design them. Kangaroo armored personnel carriers, priests with their guns removed, would carry infantry right behind the tanks, protected from the storm of fire. Searchlights would bounce artificial moonlight off the clouds to blind German gunners. The attack would begin not at dawn, but at 2300 hours, with heavy bombers dropping thousands of tons of bombs precisely on German gun lines. Then, in the confusion, two armored divisions would punch forward in narrow columns at maximum speed, bypassing strongpoints, driving deep into the German rear. When the attack exploded out of the night, the Germans were completely surprised. The 12th SS and 89th Infantry Division reeled backwards. By morning, Simonds' spearheads were 15 kilometers deep, an advance unprecedented in the Normandy campaign outside Patton's later exploits. German prisoners taken that night spoke of chaos, of tanks appearing from nowhere, of officers screaming orders no one could obey. Kurt Meyer, the ruthless commander of the Hitlerjugend, later wrote in his memoirs that Totalize was the moment he realized the Canadians had become something entirely new and terrifying under their young general. Yet Totalize stalled just short of complete victory, slowed by cautious subordinates and fierce counterattacks. Simonds learned from the near miss with the same cold intensity he applied to everything. 3 days later, he launched Operation Tractable, again using artificial moonlight, again attacking in daylight, but with massive smoke screens that turned day into twilight. This time nothing stopped him. The fillets fell. The pocket closed. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 Germans were killed or captured, their vehicles littering the roads in what Allied soldiers grimly called the corridor of death. German commanders now spoke of Simonds in the same breath as Guderian or Rommel, but with added dread. Because unlike the great panzer leaders, Simonds never seemed to make a mistake twice, never allowed ego to override calculation, and never, ever gave the Germans the kind of battle they wanted. He was, in the words of one captured staff officer, a machine in human form. And the war was far from over. In the months to come, he would teach the Wehrmacht even harder lessons, in the Scheldt estuaries on the Hochwald Ridge across the Rhine itself. Each time the Germans thought they had his measure, Simonds changed the rules again. By September 1944, the name Simonds circulated through German headquarters the way a death notice travels through a village, quietly, quickly, and with unmistakable finality. Field Marshal Walter Model, the Führer's fireman, was sent west specifically to stop the Allied advance. When he studied the situation map, he spent long minutes staring at the Canadian sector, then muttered to his chief of staff, "If that man ever gets loose on open ground, we are finished." Model knew what many Allied generals still refused to accept. Guy Simonds had become the most dangerous corps commander on the Western Front. The next ordeal was the Scheldt. Antwerp had fallen intact in early September, the greatest port on the continent, but it was useless while the Germans held both banks of the 30-mile estuary leading to the sea. Without Antwerp, the Allied supply line still stretched 300 miles back to Normandy. Winter was coming. If the port could not be opened, the war might drag into 1946. Eisenhower told Montgomery the Scheldt was now the single most important objective in Europe. Montgomery, in turn, handed the dirtiest job to Simonds and the two Canadian corps: clear the estuary while the rest of the Allied armies paused to breathe. The ground was a nightmare. South of the West Scheldt lay Breskin's Pocket, a flooded polder crisscrossed by dikes, every inch covered by concrete bunkers and the veteran 64th Infantry Division. North of the estuary stood Walcheren Island, its dikes bristling with coastal batteries that had been built to repel the Royal Navy, now turned inland. Between them flowed a mile of freezing water patrolled by German E-boats, and mined to the bottom. Every senior officer who looked at the map said the same thing. It was impossible before spring. Simonds looked at the same map and saw something different. He saw water as a highway, not a barrier. He began with the kind of deception that would have made a Byzantine general proud. While the 3rd Canadian Division prepared a conventional assault across the Leopold Canal, the obvious route, and therefore the one the Germans expected, Simonds quietly moved the 2nd Canadian Division by night all the way around to the rear, embarking them in Buffalo amphibious vehicles at Terneuzen. On October 6th, the 3rd Division attacked frontally at dawn and was stopped cold, exactly as Simonds intended. The Germans rushed every reserve to seal the breach. 48 hours later, in pitch darkness and pouring rain, the 2nd Division landed behind them in the Breskin's pocket. The 64th Division woke up surrounded. What followed was 10 days of the most savage close-quarters fighting of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. Germans fought from house to house, from dike to dike, knowing capture often meant execution for earlier atrocities against Canadian prisoners. Simonds fed in fresh battalions, rotated exhausted ones out, and never let the pressure slacken. He personally flew over the battlefield in an Oster spotter plane at treetop height, directing artillery fire with an ice-calm voice while flak burst around him. By November 3rd, the Breskin's pocket had ceased to exist. Over 12,000 Germans marched into captivity. The rest lay beneath the mud. But Walcheren still blocked the estuary. The island's dikes were 4 meters thick, and the garrison had orders to fight to the last round. A direct amphibious assault would be suicidal. Simonds proposed something that made RAF Bomber Command gasp. Deliberately breach the dikes and flood the interior, drowning the guns and forcing the defenders on the high ground at the perimeter where they could be crushed. On 3, 7, and October 11th, waves of Lancasters dropped 10,000 tons of bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The sea rushed in. Walcheren became a shallow lake, dotted with German strongpoints like islands. Then came the strangest battle of the war. British and Canadian Marines in landing craft, commandos wading waist-deep, buffaloes churning through flooded fields, while the Germans fired from church steeples and farmhouse roofs rising above the water. Simonds watched from a windmill tower, coat collar turned up against the spray, issuing orders that sounded almost gentle over the radio. Black Watch, advance to the church. 5th Brigade, swing left and take the dunes. Calmly now, calmly. By November 8th, Walcheren was Canadian. The Scheldt was open. The first supply ship reached Antwerp on November 28th. Eisenhower sent a personal signal. The achievements of the Canadian Army in this operation will live as an outstanding example in military history. The Germans said nothing at all. They were too busy counting the divisions they no longer had. Yet even this triumph did not satisfy Simonds. He believed the war could still be lost through caution. In December 1944, while the world's attention fixed on the Ardennes, he began planning Operation Veritable, the assault on the Siegfried line between the Maas and the Rhine. He intended to use the entire 1st Canadian Army, 450,000 men and 35,000 vehicles, in a narrow corridor between the rivers. The ground was forest and flood, the defenses 3 layers deep, the defending army commanded by Alfred Schlemm, one of the best defensive generals Germany had left. Simonds spent Christmas studying title charts and soil samples. He ordered 1,400 heavy bombers, 1,100 guns, and every specialized vehicle in 21st Army Group. He rehearsed the attack again and again until his divisional commanders could recite timings in their sleep. When Montgomery asked if he needed more time, Simonds replied, "I have had 5 years. That is enough." The attack exploded on February 8th, 1945, in weather so vile that even the Rhine seemed to be raining upwards. For 10 days the Reichswald became a slaughter pen. Simonds drove his men forward with a ferocity that shocked even the British divisions attached to him. He sacked a brigadier on the spot for hesitating. He slept 3 hours a night in a caravan behind the lines, emerging with new orders that always seemed to anticipate the next German move. By February 21st, the Siegfried line was shattered. Gotch had fallen, and Schlemm's army was streaming eastward in disorder. One captured German colonel, asked why his regiment had collapsed so quickly, answered simply, "Because we knew it was Simonds opposite us. When it is Simonds, you die tired." The road to the Rhine now lay open. and Simonds was already thinking 3 moves ahead. By March 1945, the German officer corps had run out of illusions. In every headquarters from the Rhine to Berlin, the same question was asked in lowered voices. Where is Simonds now? Staff maps were marked with red arrows labeled simply Kanadisker Teufel, the Canadian devil. When those arrows moved, entire armies began packing before orders arrived. Guy Simonds had become the only Allied general whom the Wehrmacht genuinely feared would reach Berlin before the Russians. The final act began on the night of March 23, 1945, Operation Plunder and Varsity, the assault crossing of the Rhine. Montgomery, ever theatrical, planned the greatest set piece of the war. 2,000 guns, airborne divisions, searchlights, the works. Simonds was given the most difficult sector, opposite the fortified town of Rhine and the grim heights of the Hochwald Ridge beyond. The current was swift, the far bank high and steep, the defenses manned by fresh paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Army. Everyone expected a costly slog. Simonds did the opposite of what everyone expected. While the British 51st Highland Division and the Commandos staged a noisy assault at Rhine to pin the defenders, Simonds secretly moved the entire 2nd Canadian Division 30 miles upstream to the American sector. There, under cover of darkness and General Simpson's 9th Army smokescreen, they crossed with the Americans at Wesel in buffaloes and stormboats without losing a single vehicle. By the first time in history, an entire Commonwealth division crossed the lower Rhine virtually unopposed. While German reserves rushed toward the sound of guns at Rhine, Simonds' corps was already 15 kilometers into the rear, cutting the last escape routes of the German Army Group H. The commander of the German LXXVI Corps, taken that morning, was found still clutching an order from Berlin. Hold the Rhine to the last man. Simonds is not repeat not in your sector. The prisoner laughed bitterly when he read it. He was here before we even knew the attack had started. With the Rhine behind him, Simonds finally had the open ground he had waited for since Normandy. He unleashed what he had rehearsed in his mind for years. The armored pursuit at maximum speed. The 4th Canadian Armored Division, led by the battle-hardened Canadian Grenadier Guards and Lake Superior Regiment, advanced 300 kilometers in 12 days, a rate that made even Patton's staff blink. Towns that had prepared elaborate defenses surrendered at the sight of the red Canadian shoulder patches. One mayor in Oldenburg handed over the keys, saying, "We held against the British for weeks in 1918. Against Simonds we lasted 4 hours." The German 15th Army simply dissolved. Whole divisions threw down their weapons and marched west with white flags before a shot was fired. Simonds' orders were merciless. Prisoners will be directed to the rear. Do not slow down for them. Columns drove day and night, headlights blazing, bypassing resistance, leaving pockets for follow-up infantry. Fuel trucks leapfrogged forward by air. A German staff officer captured near Bremen wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting an army. We are being hunted." On April 20th, the 2 Canadian Corps reached the river Elbe near Lauenburg, only 60 miles from Berlin. Simonds stood on a dike, watching his reconnaissance troops trade shots with Soviet patrols on the far bank. He was 42 years old and had destroyed or captured the equivalent of 20 German divisions in 10 months. That evening, he sent a short signal to Army HQ. Further advance east serves no military purpose. Awaiting orders. It was the only time in the campaign he had ever asked for permission to stop. He never received the order to continue. Political decisions had already been taken at Yalta. The Canadians turned north instead, liberating the northern Netherlands and accepting the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany on May 5, 1945. When the final ceasefire came, Simonds was in Oldenburg, writing orders for the occupation. A British liaison officer found him at 2 a.m., still at his desk. "It's over, sir," the officer said. Simonds looked up, eyes red from lack of sleep, and replied quietly, "It was over the day we crossed the Rhine." In the end, the statistics were staggering. From D-Day to V-Day, the 1st Canadian Army under Crerar and Simonds suffered 85,000 casualties, but inflicted over 400,000 on the enemy, more than any other Allied army group of comparable size. German records captured after the war revealed that Army Group B, 21st Army Group's intelligence summary for April 1945 listed Simonds as the most feared Allied commander west of the Elbe. Higher than Patton, higher than Patch, higher than any American name. Yet when the victory parades marched through London and Ottawa, Simonds was nowhere to be seen. He refused knighthoods, avoided reporters, and returned quietly to Canada to become chief of the General Staff at 46, the youngest in Commonwealth history. He died in 1974, still only 71, leaving instructions that there was to be no military funeral, no eulogies, no statues. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific from a small boat off Vancouver Island. Old German veterans, when asked decades later whom they respected most among the Allied generals, rarely mentioned Montgomery or Patton. They spoke instead of a thin Canadian with cold eyes who never raised his voice, who attacked at night, who flooded islands, who crossed rivers where none should have been crossed, and who, when he appeared opposite a position, simply erased it from the map. They never learned his first name. To the end of their lives, they called him only Der Kanadische General, and they were still afraid.